Hello. Welcome. How's everybody doing today? Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see all of you guys here today. I'm excited about today's event. Some great discussion coming up. Lots of good things. Before we get started, I just wanted to... well, my name is Hector Figarella. I'm a member of the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee, and I'd like to welcome you guys all for being here today. I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's event. Co-sponsors. Thank you, Neighbor to Neighbor, for allowing us to use the space. Also, they're co-sponsoring Arise for Social Justice, the Pioneer Valley Worker Center, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, Party for Socialism and Liberation, the Militarized Western Mass, Massachusetts Peace Action, United Student Labor Action Coalition at Smith College, the Leanne Western Mass, Co-Pink Western Mass, River Valley Democratic Socialists of America, Brattleboro Solidarity, and Graduate Employee Organization, UAW 2322. Thank you so much for co-sponsoring today's event. Just to give you a sense of what's coming up, we have our three wonderful presenters today who went to Cuba today went to Cuba for May Day this year. And I'm excited to hear what they have to say today and share with us their experience. Also, the event today, we're going to have our presenters present for probably about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a discussion, breakout groups. That should be about 15 to 20 minutes or so. We have some questions that we would like you guys to delve into. Great. So why are we here today? Why are we talking about Cuba today? Why is Cuba important? So today's discussion. Why is Cuba relevant to... Why has Cuba been under attack for the past 60 years? A brutal, inhumane, immoral, deadly blockade that has killed probably, I don't know the number of people, but a lot of people have died as a consequence, and people are still suffering. Things are really hard on the island. It's really hard for them to recover from the hurricane that just hit them, and also to manufacture medications because of the horrible blockade. So why is Cuba important? Why are we talking about Cuba? Why is the Cuban people's struggle important? And how does that relate to the struggle that we have here at home? Because here at home we also are fighting capitalism, imperialism. So how do those two connect? And so we're hoping to talk about that today. We also want to hear from you guys. And so thank you for being here. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Hector. My name is Miranda, and I am, of course, with the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee, along with Celina and Ramona here. And I just want to share a little bit about the organization before we get started. We are an all-volunteer collective of anti-imperialist activists here in Western Mass. Our focus is on building a local grassroots movement to oppose U.S. imperialism and capitalism and build working-class power. And we build power through mutual aid, direct action, and study. As people living in the belly of the beast here in the United States, we recognize that we need to do what we can to provide material support to those who face the brunt of U.S. aggression and advocate for concrete policy changes to ensure that not another life is lost at the hands of U.S. aggression. And most importantly, we know we can't really do any of our work without learning from each other and those who have been in this struggle long before us, particularly struggles against the U.S. empire. So we are committed to internationalism and know that's how we're going to win a better world. And as a bit of background for how we got started, this was a couple years ago in 2019, we came together to take action against a U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia carried out against Evo Morales. And we successfully pressured our elected representatives like Congressman McGovern and Senator Ed Markey to make public statements condemning the coup, which was later overturned after the Bolivians took to the streets in protest. But getting a small statement from these elected representatives took a lot of work. So we realized there was a real need for sustained anti-imperialist organizing here in Western Massachusetts. And here we are. So I would say that our campaign addressing U.S. sanctions on Venezuela has been our most robust. So we just want to give you all a little preview of what that campaign has looked like. For years, we've called on Congressman McGovern and others to lift sanctions on Venezuela. These sanctions have caused tens and thousands of deaths, preventing people from getting basic medical supplies like ventilators, like prenatal pills, diabetes medication, and we protested in front of his office and tirelessly advocated to his staff. And finally, he published a letter to the Biden administration condemning sanctions, and this is the strongest, policy experts have said this is the strongest stance they've seen against Congress, period. And it made big waves in Venezuela as well. We know, though, that this letter is not enough, so we continue to pressure the congressman so long as his colleagues in Washington are standing by while millions more die at the hands of U.S. aggression and these sanctions. And even this week, Celina and Hector got him face-to-face where he recommitted to taking action in Congress. So we will be following up with him. And we know engaging in this direct action is just one part of our work. We're committed to building mutual aid with groups on the ground in Venezuela. We currently have worked with the Altos de la Dese commune in Caracas and now the Luese Caceres commune in Barcelona, and these communes are self-organized communities that provide medical care, security, neighborhood maintenance, and carry out anti-racist, feminist, working-class organizing. So we've been able to raise about $8,000 to support Altos de la Dese, and recently have been able to send much-needed materials to Luisa Caceres commune for their recycling plant. Any funds we raise today will be sent to hurricane relief efforts in Cuba. So thanks for listening. That's just a little bit more about IAC, the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee, IAC for short, and where we're coming from. We're really grateful to work in coalition with a number of groups across the valley and advocate for both the anti-U.S. sanctions in Venezuela and the blockade in Cuba. And we're really excited to see you all here and talk to you about how we can work together and learn from each other and learn from our comrades in Cuba. So with that said, we had a few goals when we were talking through this event, about what we got out of the trip and what we want to make sure you get out of our presentation today. So we kind of want to center ourselves on an understanding of what's going on in Cuba and why. What is Cuba doing and why is the U.S. punishing it? And how would our reality be different if we were able to restrain our government from going after Cuba and other countries who are fighting for a better world? And lastly, how is the Cuban struggle our struggle too? How is the victory of the Cuban people tied up in the liberation of working people in the U.S.? And we're all learning together. As a disclaimer, we're not historians, we're not experts. We are committed anti-imperialists who had an amazing opportunity to study Cuba and to visit Cuba on May Day. And we know in this room there's a wealth of knowledge, so we're really looking forward to having a dialogue during our question and answers today. And on that questions and answers piece, we want to kind of ground our conversation here in the history of Cuba. Cuba, a country that ousted and held off the most powerful country in the world, the U.S., but is also a country that carries a colonial legacy and carries the baggage of colonial society. Cuba exists in this capitalist world and as a socialist state, and that's hard, and it's an ongoing process and not something that happens overnight. And we know, and our hosts in Cuba are quick to tell us, Cuba is not perfect, and we're not holding to Cuba to a bar of perfection, as it's not pretending to be that. It's a society made up of human beings that has achieved pretty extraordinary things despite really extraordinary obstacles. And we have much to learn. So we kind of ground our conversation in that. We also want to engage in our conversation today in good faith. We're all here because we oppose aggressive U.S. foreign policy, and we want to learn alternatives to capitalism. We want a better world, so that too, to center ourselves. And then we also ask that you save any questions till the end of the presentation. There's going to be plenty of time to have a discussion, and we'll do breakout groups as well. And now I will hand it over to Ramona to get us started. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Ramona. I am a member of the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee. And is that any better? That's a lot better. I can already hear it. My name is Ramona. I'm a member of the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee. I am also a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and as a day job, I'm a union organizer. So a little bit about me. but I am here to talk to you today about what the May Day Brigade was. So, late last April, very pretty early in the year, or a little bit out from it, we went on a brigade with about 100 other activists, organizers, and people who are in the struggle from all around the United States. In order to introduce them a little better, I will read the declaration that we put out as a result of the brigade. We, the young leaders and representatives of social and political organizations, student groups, labor unions, and cultural collectives in North America, assembled in La Habana, Cuba on May 1st, 2022. We met with Cuban doctors, workers, students, artists, educators, LGBTQ leaders, Black activists, community organizers, labor and religious leaders, government officials, and more in order to learn more about Cuba's current reality. Reaffirming the solidarity between the peoples of the U.S. and Cuba, this historic relationship has been pronounced by the legacies of Henry Reeve, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and countless others. As young people living in North America, we have inherited this legacy and choose to carry it into the future with us. Our presence there was very explicitly political. We marched with the Cuban people on May Day under the banner of Build the Future, Break the Blockade. This is emblazoned on our shirts, the same ones that we were wearing today. And we were invited, because we are politically active here in the United States, to engage in this brigade through the International People's Assembly, which is a multinational, international organization of grassroots people's movements all across the world, fighting for the end of capitalism and fighting for the end of imperialism and uniting these struggles wherever they are. The trip to Cuba was in this same vein. We wanted to break the blockade, we wanted to end imperialist aggression on the island, and we wanted to defend the revolutionary struggle of the Cuban people. And so we're here today to talk about that legacy. So I want to talk, in order to start this discussion, I want to ask, what are the narratives you have heard about Cuba? We can go around the circle here in the United States. We want to get a sense of what have you heard about the island? What are the narratives out there? And I guess, what are the dominant ideological tendencies that justifications that we use to attack the island? If anyone has any wants to raise their hand, I can hand over the microphone to you.
What have people heard about Cuba? Authoritarian. Authoritarian?
That they're authoritarian. Anyone else?
It's a really good place to live.
That it's a really good place to live. Anything else? That they're yeah, so they're full of communists, absolutely dripping with communists. That much might be true.
Poverty.
Poverty, yes, that's another one.
Fidel killed gay people.
That Fidel killed gay people. That is another one. Anyone else? That it's anti-black. That it is still a dictatorship. That it is proof that socialism does not work. Yes, that too. So we see that there's a lot of narratives in our society about Cuba. And a lot of them are tailored for us to hate the people, to hate the government, to hate the history of the Cuban Revolution. Especially those of us who would be natural allies throughout history to the revolution and what it has accomplished. So in order to kind of break this down a little bit, I wanted to go over, I guess, a little fundamental history of the revolution and why the U.S. is so opposed to the Cuban project, and why we spend so much time building these antagonistic narratives to the Cuban Revolution. To me, the prominent theme throughout Cuba's history, as with much of the Third World, is one of imperial plunder. First with the Spanish, with the arrival of Christopher Columbus. The Cuban island was one of the first that he landed on, and he engaged in the massacre of Taino people. Very quickly, the Spanish established sugar plantations on the island, and that became the dominant form of agricultural production throughout its history. Cuba, in essence, became a factory to send resources outside of the island, extract wealth, and push in people, African slaves, to produce wealth for the European colonies. Cuba fought, before it finally achieved its independence, 3 wars of independence to try to throw off the Spanish yoke. And that is not counting the many uprisings, the many slave rebellions, the many indigenous rebellions that happened throughout its history. Fidel himself said that the Cuban Revolution of 1959 was not one that was won when they had won at Santa Clara. It began, sorry, let me back up a little bit. The Cuban Revolution was not one that started with Moncada. It was one that started back in 1895, and even before, it began with Hatuey, Chief Hatuey, who was an indigenous man, chief, who fought against the Spanish in order to resist the imperial domination that was happening. Later on, we see this theme carry on even with new colonial masters. In 1898, as soon as the Cuban independence movement starts to gain traction, the U.S. comes in and consolidates all the independence fervor, and Cuba becomes a neo-colony of the United States under direct imperial administration. From 1898 to 1902, and then again from 1906 to 1908. This relationship was formalized through the Platt Amendment in 1902, which explicitly states that the U.S. has every right, according to its laws, to interfere with the Cuban state and its affairs. The 1933 revolution, once again, in an attempt to try to remove the imperial woke from the island, removed those people in power who had engaged in the extractionist policies under an explicitly mass movement that sought for agricultural and land reform to try to break the sugar colonies and the sugar plantations and the American landholders that owned them and extracted all the wealth from the island. Quickly, that failed. And the government became extremely corrupt. It is said that one of the presidents before Batista came into power, Brio, had a stash of cocaine in the presidential palace because of how much drug trafficking and how much relationship he had with the mafia, and how loosely they were willing to break the law and enrich themselves in order to, in their administration of the island itself. Then along comes Fidel. And the raid on the Moncada barracks in 1953. Him and a lot of other freedom fighters, on an explicit platform of agricultural reform and the break of imperialist hold on the island, he rallies several hundred people, or about 100 people, and attacks the Batista stronghold. Lots of stuff happens. I won't go into the minutia of it, but the 1959 revolution was the realization of centuries of anti-colonial struggle. It was an awakening of the people in order for people to finally have control over their own lives, over their own labor, so that they will not be exploited by people who are not on their island. It is a basic expression of freedom that many people in the third world are still struggling to shake today. So Cuba, to me and to many other anti-imperialists, stands as a stark example to the West of a former colony that not only fights bitterly for centuries against economic and political rule over the island, that not only won a struggle on its own terms, but continues to do so under the harshest conditions imposed by its former masters. And not only that, but to the hilt, supports the struggle of other countries trying to do the same.
Que viva Cuba.
And that is something that the US government and its allies cannot tolerate. That a country that has so long been subservient to our economic and political interests can stand tall on its own terms, for its own people, regardless of sorry, brain fart. Cuba stands strong on its own terms, and that is what the U.S. cannot stand. And I'll hand it off to Miranda again.
Thank you, Ramona. So each of us are gonna get about 10 minutes to share what our major takeaways were from our time in Cuba. So I think I can speak for us, where the reality we saw on May Day and during this week-long trip was twofold. We saw a country that is putting people first, that guarantees affordable housing, renowned medical care, basic human rights to all people. But we also saw a country whose every move is made so much harder by the blockade. I think when many people, maybe tourists from the U.S. in particular, think of Cuba, an image of this 1960 era car may come to your mind, and we were lucky to take kind of a course on Cuba before we went on our trip, and it was Vijay Prashad who said, taking your photo in the cute car with your sun hat, that's not cute, that's poverty. That's poverty caused by the U.S. blockade on Cuba. And so, Cuban mechanics are extremely innovative in their upkeep of these older cars, but the Cubans only rely on these cars because they can't import new models because of the blockade. And while Cuba has effectively been able to eliminate homelessness, we know that the blockade is creating a shortage of building materials, and that makes it really difficult to repair homes and build new ones. And Cuba's a leader in the pharma tech industry. They've developed 3 amazing, highly effective COVID-19 vaccines. Though it's not often possible for them to make these vaccines, they don't have access to the key raw materials needed. It was really impressive to hear about climate scientists in Cuba. Of course, on the island, they have an extensive plan for climate change, both in disaster preparedness and green technology. But again, they can't get the building materials they need to realize this plan, and that list goes on and on and on. And I think it's important to ground ourselves again in this idea that these shortages are well planned by the U.S. government, and it's really well summarized in this 1960 memorandum from the U.S. State Department, which states pretty plainly that the whole idea of the blockade is to do, this is a quote, everything possible to weaken economic life by denying money and supplies, bringing hunger and desperation, and overthrowing the government. That is the intention behind the blockade. It's clearly stated out for us. So for 60 years, the U.S. has really done everything in its power to make sure that Cuba fails. The blockade on Cuba, like sanctions on Venezuela, prevents the island from getting basic supplies that people need in order to live. And it also makes it really hard, or impossible really, for U.S. companies to do any business with Cuba, and for Cuba without getting heavily fined. And it also makes it practically impossible for anyone in the international community to do business with Cuba and the United States at the same time. So one morning I was eating breakfast with a businesswoman from Spain, and I kind of explained to her our trip and why we were there, and she was thrilled because she's in the business of, she sells building parts, and she was explaining how difficult the U.S. makes her job. And we know the majority of companies globally in this capitalist system are going to opt to do business with the United States over the tiny island of Cuba. And we know, Obama tried to normalize relations with Cuba and end the blockade, and then the Trump administration instead imposed 243 additional sanctions on the country, breaking the economy even more. The new sanctions prevented even more travel from the U.S. and Cuba, and basically disallowed any family remittances. So any money sent from the U.S. to Cuba, not allowed. You would think that during COVID-19 or during the horrible fire that broke out in Matanzas in August, or during Hurricane Ian last month, the U.S. would ease restrictions and maybe, like lend a helping hand to our neighbor, but no. And you would think that the U.S. would ease restrictions to make it easier for the country to export their life-saving vaccines to countries who need them, and still no. They're not going to do that. And I share that just because, we allegedly live in a democracy, and I don't think anyone in this room, hopefully not, agrees with this policy. And it's insane that the policy has gone on for decades and decades. But now I'll talk about what I actually want to talk about, which is the inspiration that I found in the trip and in the people of Cuba. So in the days leading up to the May 1st celebration, we got a chance to talk with workers at an electric trade union. And around May Day, it's a really busy and bustling place. There were a delegation of workers and activists from Venezuela, from Mexico, from France, and we heard from representatives from each of these countries, all who were, actively condemning U.S. imperialism, and shared how much they've learned from the Cuban people's resilience while dealing with these policies. Cuba is under enormous restraint and is still so committed to internationalism. We've seen Cuba send doctors to Venezuela when the country needed it, to Italy during the COVID breakout, supporting struggles for liberation across Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. I think we have some really interesting readings on the table back there about specifically their support for Angola. And this is something that really struck with me and stuck me the most, because in the U.S., we are intentionally not brought up in this spirit of internationalism. The people of Cuba recognize that the struggle of many of us in the United States is the struggle of Cuba. The struggle against global capitalism, a struggle for people over profit and for dignity and human rights. We were in Cuba when we found out about Roe versus Wade getting overturned. And it was comforting to be in a country that recognizes the right to choose undoubtedly. Abortion has been safe and legal in Cuba since 1976. And free. Thank you. And the spirit again has always been with Cuba. I read a beautiful memoir written by Gregory Randall, a memoir growing up in post-revolutionary Cuba in the 70s. And as a young boy, he was involved in his neighborhood committees, and they would closely follow and actively support struggles for freedom in other countries. They would invite activists and organizers in danger into Cuba, and they would celebrate their victories as if it were their victories, and they would mourn their losses as if they were their losses. It was really impactful. We really do all depend on each other, and it is possible to build solidarity across borders, and it's necessary for our collective liberation that we do build this solidarity. With Cuba, with Venezuela, with people's struggles across the globe. And another thing that really kind of struck me is that a lot of the folks I talked to, our hosts in particular, shared the revolution has always been for the children. To tangibly see, you read all about it, but see old hotels and mansions have been turned into schools and health clinics, and they've been established in every neighborhood. People as young as 16 can vote and be elected to their neighborhood committees. I think we'll talk a little bit more about the committees, but it's networks of neighborhoods organizing community safety, managing resources, and serving as a liaison between people and their government, planning blood drives, street cleanings, community gardens, educational events. And this is, something that a lot of people are engaged in. And they can even, offer proposals for new laws, as we've recently seen with the new family code. And I think, Ramona, you've told this story that has really stuck with me, where days prior to, we were visiting a working class neighbor in neighborhood in Havana, and we walked to their health clinic and to their school, which were both right in the center of the neighborhood. Ramona had a chance to speak with a mother holding a newborn baby, and she's saying, you know, she's on maternity leave for over a year. Her doctor comes and visits her in her home, and her child will grow up, you know, blocks away from this local school that we just saw, and the clinic's right there in case anyone ever needs it. And then she, you know, wants to go back to school and pursue engineering, and all for free. That's Cuba's reality. This is all free for her, and that's something I could never dream of. Like, I know when we're thinking of seeking medical care in the U.S., I've been like reflecting on this with my family and friends. Like, how many times there's times you don't go to the doctor because you don't want to look at that bill. Like, you're just not going to go. It's not that big a deal. But for this is free and available to everyone. And then, okay, sorry, talking a lot. Thanks. So, in conclusion, I think there's like a really, you know, a deep irony. We have the country of the United States peddling this narrative, and it's the same country that's intentionally strangling Cuba. It's even more ironic that despite the blockade that has cost Cuba billions and billions and billions of dollars, this small country has guaranteed its residents a quality of life that far exceeds that of like poor and working class people here in the United States. So again, we go back to that question, like, why is the United States so committed to seeing Cuba fail? This small island stands in direct opposition to U.S. capital interests, collectively building a society that prioritizes basic human needs over profit. And meanwhile, like, we know what our communities are struggling with at the hands of our own government. The, you know, same government that's causing so much strife for Cuba, you know, unaffordable healthcare, the housing crisis, skyrocketing student debt, poverty, wages, constant murders by police, rising incarceration rates. It's only 21% of U.S. workers that have access to paid maternity leave. And 45 million people in the U.S. die every year due to lack of health care. So I think there is a danger for those in power to allow the Cuban Revolution and its commitment to international solidarity and building a better world, like, for all of us to exist, because there's a danger in allowing, like, our movements here in the United States to win. So, feels so deeply. The struggle that we experience in our communities is so connected to the struggle of people in Cuba, and I feel really grateful to be able to have gone on this trip, because the more you connect these dots, the more power you realize that we have, and it's actually quite hopeful. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Celina.
Thanks, Miranda. So my name is Celina. I'm a member of the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee also, and I'm also a coordinator with Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which is one of the co-sponsors. We have some of our booklets on the table, and all of our material is free online too. So if you want to learn more about this kind of stuff and the things they don't want us to know, it's a good resource, the tricontinental.org. So that's me. One of the things I think that was really powerful for this trip, for me about this trip, timing myself too, that was really powerful about this trip is that I think one of the things that capitalism does is that it kills our ability to dream, and so it becomes easier to imagine the end of the world and being like flooded by ice caps, by dying in nuclear war, by all of these things, than it is to imagine a world in which our dignity is reaffirmed. And there's actually a place in the world, there are a few places in the world, there's a place on the scale of an entire country in the world that shows us something that we deserve that actually exists. And that not only exists, but it exists despite, like, this country has the biggest military in the world. We effectively control much of the international finance system. And the U.S. has poured millions, and actually billions probably. I'm not a big math whiz, and I actually have a reading rec if you want to learn more numbers that I'm not going to give you, which is Helen Yaffe wrote a great book called We Are Cuba, but I don't know the actual number. But I know that the U.S. has put millions and millions of dollars, or more money than I can even imagine, of our money, instead of giving people here housing and the things we deserve, into suffocating Cuba, into funneling them into CIA trainings for Cuban so-called exiles, actually like terrorist groups who have shot down airplanes. That was something I had to read about. Some people might have been alive when that happened. Like a CIA-trained Cuban-American exile hijacked a plane and killed like all 70-something people on it. That was funded by our tax money. And so not only like despite like all of these obstacles, like CIA, domestic terrorism, like promoted by our government, by the blockade, being shut out of the international finance system, like Cuba still exists. And I think that's just like an extremely hopeful thing, because actually on the way, I just hear all the time, like, young people don't want to get involved. Well, like, I'm sorry, but this is full of young people, and it's not true. And like, people are hungry, and people are struggling with housing and all these things, and there's a place in the world. It's not to romanticize things, and something I heard over and over and over again in Cuba is like, we're not perfect. Like, what can we learn from you? And I'm like, I don't know, that's humbling. Like, I don't know. But like, we have so much to learn because they still exist, and because like, Miranda mentioned some of these things, but 96% of the population owns their own home, which is crazy because, like, I don't know, my landlord threatened to evict me 3 times last year, and I'm like hardly the most, for no reason, and I'm hardly the most oppressed person in terms of U.S. demographics, but like, most people struggle with housing security, struggle with just like basic things. I don't need to give a lecture on that, but in Cuba, despite all of this, 96% of the population own their own homes. But like, every time like every single thing we saw that was amazing, there was like an and but with the blockade. So 96% of the population owns their own homes, but there's a shortage of building materials. And so if you actually walk around Cuba, it's not that everybody's living in like this beautiful mansion and everything's perfect. Things are actually really hard, because when you have kids, like, there are no building materials, right? And so like, a lot of the homes are overcrowded. People still, like, I didn't see, the only person I saw sleeping in the street in Cuba was at 4 o'clock in the morning, the May Day parade, because the entire country, not only did 5.5 million people, half of the island's 11 million population, come out on May Day, but they were all there at 4 a.m. sharp, when it's like cold, and like, it's not cold, but whatever, it's like, for a tropical country, it's a little chilly in the morning, and it's like, and it's dark, and everyone was there at 4 o'clock in the morning, and like, it's, no one's working because it's May Day, so if you don't have a bus there, then you like go out and party, and you like take a nap on the street, because it's also really, really safe. And then you're just up and you go. That's the only time I saw somebody sleeping on the streets. And so all of these things exist, and I think like, it's the duty of everybody else, of all of us, and all of us in the belly of the beast, not only to protect that because it's like the right thing, but because like, that just shows us that it's not true, that like, we've arrived at the end of the world and capitalism is the only thing. And we actually get to imagine not like what it looks like to like put a rubber stamp and copy and paste Cuba in the US, but like, imagine what we could build here, because we deserve those things. Yeah, I have a whole list. I could talk forever, and I won't, but like, just everything. It was like, well, 95% of the population has clean drinking water, which like, frankly, I don't know the number here, but like, I don't think Flint has clean water yet. So, but like, they don't have, like, there's not running water from the tap all day because there's a shortage of oil since the U.S. put sanctions on Venezuela, which was giving Cuba oil, and they can't replace all the motor parts. So in order to regulate what they have, the water's shut off for a lot of the day. So you turn it on, it's regulated by these CDR structures, which I'll talk about too. But it's just, things are hard. And I don't think any of us are trying to romanticize anything, but like, people aren't like dying frozen in the streets under underpasses or in dumpsters like they are in our country. And so I think, yeah, whenever we think critically, and I'm really excited to hear people's questions, but I think that's why for us, or for me anyway, it's so important to ground it in that. And I did want to mention one of the things, Miranda mentioned the biotech industry, but I learned, and when we came back to the U.S., we had to get COVID screenings, PCR tests. And the place where we got them, the hospital that was giving us tests, is one of the like, I was chatting with the front desk guy, and he was telling me that they have a lung cancer vaccine, which is crazy because we can't access it here because of the blockade. So I don't know how many of you, like, we had one of the people who helped start this group, IAC, Marty Nathan, was an amazing comrade, and she died last November of lung cancer. And I have to wonder if Marty would be dead if it weren't for the fucking blockade. Because there is a lung cancer vaccine, and there is very effective treatment. And not only like, can we not get it, but like, how much further along could Cuban medicine be if we didn't stop trying to sabotage it? Not we, because I'm not trying to stop, like, no one here is, but like, if our government didn't make it so hard not only to access what they've developed despite all these things, like, how much further along would that be? Like, I don't know, maybe no one would have cancer. No one would die from cancer. Like, is that true? Maybe, I don't know. Like, they're incredibly inventive. They're like motivated by this desire to like put people first and make these extraordinary sacrifices. So if we didn't get sabotaged at every little turn, like, how much further along would we be as a society? And I think that's one of the reasons it's important to protect Cuba. Like, not from a humanitarian, like, yeah, okay, like, humanitarianism actually is good. And like, we should care about people, but like, it's necessary. Like, anyway, so that's that. But I can get carried away. But I think one of the other things that was really amazing that we saw too, and I appreciate whoever yelled out dictatorship, thank you for bringing that up, because it's like that's just the thing you hear, even if we don't think it, and it's preaching to the choir. It's like, oh, like communist dictator. One of the spaces we got to be in, there's these local neighborhood structures called CDRs. It's a Democratic Committee for the Revolution. So it's like, imagine if your block was organized and had basically like a block captain, and then through that structure, all throughout the country, people actually get to participate in their own democracy, which is like wild to me, because I'm still arguing about parking after a year, which one of my neighbors here probably knows that. In the meantime, Cuba just passed the Code of Families on September 25th. And 5 million, so Cuba has a population of 11 million. 5 million people participated in that process. Half of the entire country. I can't park on my street, and Cuba has half of the population reforming the Constitution. So 5 million people participated in that. There were 400,000 proposals as to like how they wanted to change it. 48% of the code changed throughout that process. So the Cuban Communist Party like submitted the document to be debated, and then half of it got changed through like popular feedback, and a lot of that happens through these like local structures. So they're your neighborhood committees. There are ways to engage through your workplace, through like every imaginable kind of way, so that people are like included in the democratic process. And that doesn't mean that things aren't hard, and that doesn't mean that like every person in Cuba is a communist and like everybody's perfectly happy, because also their lives are pretty hard because of the blockade. But that's just wild to me to imagine that. And one of the things, the most, I think, known thing about the family code is that it recognizes gay marriage, which is great. But something that's really interesting that I learned there too is that there was a conversation. Cuba has reformed its constitution, unlike us, multiple times, most recently in 2019. And the gay marriage conversation was part of like when they were discussing reforming the constitution. In 2019, but like people still were having a lot of debate about it. So they said, okay, well, we're not just going to force this on you. We're not going to say, okay, like we decree gay marriage, right? Like society has some stuff to work out. We're going to do this, and we're going to have even more debate. So that's what the Code of Family was. So they legalized gay marriage. Maternity leave is 2 years. Not only for like mothers, but for whoever's going to caretake for the child. So if you're a mother, you want to have a baby, but you don't really want to be at home caretaking, like the father or your uncle or the grandparents or whoever it is, or your like dear friend and neighbor, like can be the caretaker and have maternity leave. So it just gives like, it recognizes like broader kinship ties and families instead of this kind of, I don't have any paid maternity leave on a federal level in this country. And one of the things, I appreciate someone shouting this out too, with like, yeah, there's been a long struggle, and no revolution is perfect because it's made of human beings. And I think like LGBTQ rights has been part of that. And one of the groups that we met with was Trans Cuba at Cenesex, which some of you might have heard of. And one of the things that they told us is like, like they met with the president also as part of these debates. And if the government had more resources, if it wasn't suffering so much under the blockade, like that would also mean more for the trans community. And so there are lots of struggles being developed over time, but I think like, I don't know, that spoke a lot to me, that like the sector of society that is like probably most pointed to in the US of like, Cuba's bad because like that. And it's like, well, like, yeah, they actually are really struggling like many Cubans. There are many like particular struggles. It's been a long process. Like, yeah, revolutions are made of human beings, and human beings that were also like shaped by like Cuba being the United States playground for a really long time, and like that's something that is ongoing. But the family code guarantees free gender reassignment surgery by like really quality doctors. Cuban doctors are renowned throughout the world. There's free assisted reproduction for same-sex couples. Yeah, and no one said this one, but like sexism is one. Like, oh, it's like a sexist dictator, but like 54% of parliament is women. It's the second highest number in the world. So, I don't know. It was just really amazing to be somewhere and to have these conversations with people who are like working out their struggles in whatever parts of the revolution they're still shaping, but who are like doing it and what that means for us. And I think one of the questions I kept asking, I've asked like as many people as I can, I think when we were there, was like, oh, what can we do? How can we help? And I think that like the most powerful answer to that, we have like some short-term answers we'll talk about. Not short-term, but like immediate things we'll talk about like at the end. But I think it's like going home and building a revolution here, because we deserve it, because we deserve not to die frozen in a dumpster, and we deserve not to like be all of the things that capitalism flicks on us. And also like Cuban people want that for us. And Cuba, what did a reporter asked Che, like, what can we do? What can the U.S. do for you? And he said, leave us alone. Like, get our government to leave them alone, so we can get Cuba to, like, the U.S. to leave Cuba alone and spend all the money it's spending on the CIA, like trying to overthrow their government on housing and all the other things that we deserve. So I'm going to stop blabbing. But it was really amazing for me to see, like, not that like there's some like perfect utopia. Yeah, people are struggling and all of these things, but there's actually a place in the world that's accomplished so much and has so much discipline, and that we have so much to learn from. So thanks for listening.
The final takeaway that I had when I was on the island, when I was there, honestly, we saw so many people celebrating on May Day. About 700,000 people were in the street in the Havana there when we went. And it was such a joyous occasion. And the night before, we had toured all these, as they called it, neighborhoods in transition, where they were extremely poor neighborhoods that they were pushing so many resources into reconstruction and into infrastructure projects so that people could have consistent running water, running electricity, under severe conditions of blockade. We've been learning about all these incredible things that the Cuban people, and out on May Day we saw so much happiness and so much jubilation for what the collective people had accomplished. But when I was there, honestly, I couldn't really feel anything but a deep grief. And I had said this to you guys when we were there, that my main takeaway, like, when I was on the island was just, they have so little and have so access to so little, but yet take so many efforts at every level of their society to make sure that everyone is housed, everyone is fed, everyone has access to health care, and that no one has to unnecessarily struggle more than anyone else. And there is an extreme level of poverty on the island. That much is evident. And that is a direct result of the blockade. Life in Cuba is hard. But people have access to the essentials, and they don't have to go into hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt in order to pay for their cancer. I think so many of people in the audience right now can think of a family member who might still be alive, as Celina said. If we had a system, anything like that, with so few resources, they have better healthcare outcomes than we do in the richest fucking country in the world. We spend so much of our resources as a country destabilizing other nations, trying to claw themselves out of the historical legacies that we have put them under. And even here at home, we work, and we are constantly put in debt, medical, educational, and our surplus value, I'm a Marxist, I'm sorry, is constantly robbed from us, keeping us in a cycle of poverty. That doesn't happen naturally. That is a system that that is upheld and that we enforce not only here at home, but all across the world. In Cuba, a lot of the neighborhoods, as I mentioned, were very deeply in poverty. And on the first day that we were there, like touring around on April 30th, before the May Day Brigade, you had introduced this anecdote a little bit before. We were in the neighborhood of transition, and there are a lot of poverty, and I couldn't help but think, like, these look a lot like the houses that my abuela grew up in. My family is from Mexico. They immigrated here in the 70s. And my grandma didn't know how to read until she was older, until she was an adult, until she moved here. And my abuelo had to work so often that he was almost never home until we moved to the States. And they couldn't imagine, while in Mexico, like, their children having access to education, having consistent access to healthcare. A lot of injuries, she would tell me that, like, when When my dad had a cut when he was little, she was so worried that it would get infected because she couldn't have the money to take him to the doctor. We're in this neighborhood in La Habana that looks a lot like the photos that my abuela would show me of the conditions that she grew up under. And yet this mother, this 18-year-old mother, like living in these conditions very similar, she is not only going to university, she's having all of her needs met by the state. She is having opportunities that would never be afforded to even us here. I can think of so many people in my life that 2 years, or at that time 1 year before the family code, of maternity leave would be transformational. That is not a guarantee here. Imagine what regular people would be able to accomplish with their lives if they were able to go to school for free in those conditions. Deepest of poverty, she was training to be a biochemical engineer, to engage in Cuba's most, premier industry, their biotechnical industry, to produce the raw materials for their healthcare system. It's not about, for me, it's not about like how difficult it is on the island, because it is extremely difficult. There's no denying that. It's about dignity. It is about human dignity. I forget where I read this, but Cuba has been described not as a perfect system, but as a humane system. And I think of, when I was there, I thought of all the people who I know here, all the struggles that I've had in my life, and all the wasted potential, human potential that I see every fucking day. And we live in the fucking richest country in the world. Why don't we have that here? I mean, really, like, really. It's robbery on an incredible scale. And so when I came back, I was, I mean, the people around me noticed a difference. I couldn't do anything but dedicate myself to realizing that potential and realizing that struggle in my life. And that is what Cuba means, not only to me, not only to us here in AAC, but to everyone around the world struggling against capitalism, against imperialism, against racism. It is a way out. It's not the way out, but it is a way out. It is an example that it is possible, that we can be free, and that we have every obligation, not just to each other, but to ourselves, to realize that future. So, I'll leave it at that. I can go on. But, Celina, I think it's a good time for us to go into breakout groups so we can discuss and ask ourselves questions about what we can do next. So I'll pass it on to my comments.
So I guess what we'll do is we'll take folks' question from each group. Maybe we can just start in this corner of the room here. Did you all have a question you wanted to share?
My question is,
Oh, Nick, do you want to take the mic?
well, I can speak loudly. My question is how to get to go to Cuba in the most easy way.
Okay, so the question was, how do you go to Cuba? What's the easiest way to go to Cuba?
So sneak peek, because that was on our last part of this. Afterwards will be kind of some asks and direction, but one of them is going to be go to Cuba. So there are a number of, I was actually surprised how easy it was to go logistically, because all of the obnoxious obstacles that the U.S. sets up, like when you go with a brigade, they're just like, here's the thing you have to fill out. This is the box you check. This is the thing. And I was like, oh, cool. I'm in Cuba. This is great. And so there are a number of brigades, some that I would suggest. We can write this on a piece of paper. But Pastors for Peace leads some really amazing brigades. It's not just a religious thing. I'm not religious. I'm a bad half Catholic and a bad half Jew and not religious at all. And I have heard really wonderful things about their brigade. Code Pink, I know, is a co-sponsor of this event. Pockies and Code Pink, they lead brigades. I have this written down. Venceremos has brigades. So there are a number. Those are 3 really good ones. I would suggest folks like sign up and go on a brigade because you also get a different kind of experience. Like, I mean, you wander around and you have conversations and that's great, but like I probably wouldn't have like been able to talk to the foreign ministry about like what it's like. I probably wouldn't have gotten like a tour with like Cuban doctors of like a CDR and that kind of thing. So I would really suggest that. I don't know if you guys. Okay. Did that group have any other questions?
Any main themes or takeaways that you guys wanted to share with the group as?
Yeah, like, I mean, we first kind of like talked about kind of like being in the belly of the beast and like this, you know, kind of like what Celina said about, oh God, how I conceptualize it was like the devil that you know, like you don't know, and specifically like a lot of people are kind of like in the belly of the beast are like frustrated with the times, and so we're kind of like looking outwards as opposed to inwards, right? Like we're looking around us and like seeing like what can work. Like we're here today learning about like the successes of like the Cuban Revolution, because it still goes on today, right? And how do we like kind of like tie that to out here in the belly of the beast, within like the expressions of like the movements within the youth, and it really transcends like the youth, right? You know, multi-generational expressions, not only here in the States, but also in Europe. You know, you see like, I think the other day I saw like an expression from these 2 like youth activists. They just like threw tomato soup at the Van Gogh painting, which was really awesome. Like, I don't know if, I'm not anti-Van Gogh, right? The Van Gogh painting is beautiful and it's fine. There's glass, so it's not unharmed. But it was an expression, right, against like, you know, rich people, right, and them kind of like taking over art, and so it's what I'm trying to say is that we talked about like the expressions that are going on and looking outwards for solutions, right, and Cuba is full of those solutions, and we're getting frustrated, we're expressing ourselves, and this is really an expression of that, and so that's what we talked about first, and then we talked about what ideas do the Cuban Revolution about? What ideas does the Cuban Revolution give you about your own struggles? How can these ideas? How can you bring these ideas back to your organizing work and life? And we talked about kind of like learning the lessons from the past, which is, I mean, also what we're doing here, right? Learning the lessons of the Cuban Revolution, learning the mighty successes of the Cubano, right, and the revolutionaries there. Learning how successful they are, right, with the recent family code. That was one of the most democratic things probably ever to happen in the world. And so really just like looking inwards in that way, while also looking outwards, right? Looking inwards and like studying the successes. I did have a main question that I didn't propose in the group, which was like, it's kind of like a main thing in my head with revolutions is like, you know, defending the most marginalized people, right? You know, people of color, but especially for me, like I'm a queer person, and so like defending queer people. I here in the belly of the beast, right? I feel like kind of like, since we're in Western Mass, I feel that it's a very queer-friendly place. Even in Holyoke, I actually feel like way more comfortable in Holyoke than Northampton, surprisingly, but that's something else. That's probably a class thing. But, you know, like, I think that we're the exception and not the case, right? The whole entirety of it. And so, like, you're starting to see kind of like in other, specifically in Southern and even other parts of the States, you know, queer people are kind of like being, you know, attacked, right? There's this full sort assault against queer people from, you know, capitalists, you know, people in charge, whatever it may be, people in governance, making laws. And so like revolutions, you know, some revolutions take care of queer people, I haven't really seen any that don't. But how do we like take care of our own like marginalized groups in revolutions, right? People of color, indigenous people. How do we, include them in these conversations that we talk about radically transforming society? Because I feel like that's a really important factor, and I think Cuba did it really well. I think Cuba's doing it amazingly, exceptionally well, specifically with not only queer people but people of color, right? I think it's like not only the largest demographic for like women, but also for like people of color in governance, doing these things. So that's my long-winded like general question as to like how do we bringing marginalized people. I don't know, maybe like we don't have an answer to that, but maybe that's a conversational starter, right? So I'll just hand it back.
Thank you, JR. Anybody else from other group or over here?
Hello. The group that I was a part of, we were kind of hovering and coalescing about the general theme of how, kind of similar to what JR was saying, like how do we organize like on a small scale in our communities when everybody is so struggling on their own so intensely that it can be hard to find the energy or time or motivation to go to a meeting or join a mutual aid group or volunteer when a lot of people feel very overwhelmed. So that's kind of what we were talking about, and our question is kind of along the lines of what can we learn from Cubans like pre-revolution and also now in how they organize in their communities and what we can do better and differently here. That's what we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting with your group when the discussion was about that, but I guess I could relate it back a little bit to my experience in organizing and also a little bit to myself. Like when I became like the most politically active, and I started becoming the most politically active, I was homeless, and I work as a union organizer, and every single day I talk to people who are migrants who literally spend so many hours a day at work, like exhausted. They tell me about how they feel it in their shoulders and their bodies, and like literally some of the poorest conditions that you see, like, but those are the people who will always be the most militant and most invested in their own liberation. So in terms of and we see this throughout history, like the I guess what's a good example of that, most of the revolutions in history have been carried out not by like tireless organizers who make these, that is an important part of it, but the most important core of that are the people who do little things every single day and who march and who fight and who stand up against the tyranny of their own lives, right? So in terms of, I guess, how I think about this question is how do we agitate and how do we activate those around us in order to be engaged in their own liberation, those of us who are most I'm assuming a lot of us are politically active and most of us are activists, organizers in our own regards. So how do we do that? How do we bring normal people into that struggle? And how do we make that? Because that is the only way that we're going to win, by creating that consciousness. I feel like I kind of talked around the question, honestly, but yeah, I mean, the most downtrodden people will be the most willing, and I see this in my work, to go the extra mile if they have like when I was in that condition, I had a realization that I deserved better, and that is what brought me to the place that I am today. So what we need to be doing is, we're not like we're not saviors. We're not doing anything that will we're not causing people to do this, but like help people understand that they are worth fighting for, that they themselves are worth fighting for themselves. But that is, yeah, that's how I would answer that. If anyone else wants to take a stab at that, but otherwise we can move to the next question.
No, thank you, Ramona. I think that to your question, JR, a phrase that I feel like we heard a lot, and I forget who coined the term, like a revolution within a revolution. Like in your revolution, there should be, like we like owe it to each other to have folks who are the most marginalized have that representation. So I think, yeah, that phrase really, definitely stuck with me. Like, what does it look like for LGBTQ people, for Black and Brown people, for women to have leadership in these revolutions, and how are we centering their stories and their struggles? And then also, I think to organize, I think people, we're all really busy. Like, people are really busy, and I think it's hard. It's really hard, especially in our culture, to make time for things like organizing. And something I know, Celina, I feel inspired by you, and you too, Ramona, talking about the discipline that we do need, when we are tired and when we don't really want to do it and we don't want to enter any more data in the spreadsheet or whatever it is. We have to do these little tasks, and we have to meet people where they're at and have these conversations, these agitating conversations Ramona's speaking about. And I think it's hard work, and I think we, as much as we're able, and each person knows their own capacity, but you know your capacity and you know what you're able to give to these kind of movements. And then I definitely had one other thing I was going to say, but I can't remember it. So.
Yeah, maybe to add to that also, I think there's the question, what can we learn from Cuban pre-revolution and organizing in their communities? And I think these are such amazing and big questions that these aren't really true answers. They're just suggestions, and then one of which would be to go back and study and not just read a book to read a book. Because if you're reading a book and you're not doing anything with it, I don't know, go read what are the vampire books? Whatever, Twilight. Read that. But if you're gonna sorry, I'm bad at pop culture, but we're studying because we want to learn, and I think hopefully a study can come out of that to try to answer those questions. But Miranda said this too, but I think I was really struck by discipline also, and by how much Cubans live and breathe the revolution. So yeah, of course there are mistakes, and of course there are things that they're have had to course correct many times and continue to do so. But yeah, there's this thing in Western Mass that happens. I've stopped using the word boundaries after I moved here because it just gets weaponized in this way where people don't feel like doing things because it's too comfortable not to, so we just don't. Mm-hmm. And everybody, Miranda said this, everybody knows their own what their actual boundary is, because that is where maybe I should start reclaiming. But having discipline because we're living and breathing these things. And I think people, yeah, I mean, Ramona answered the other question amazingly, so I won't repeat that, but I think when people know that these are their movements and these are their spaces, there are movements in our spaces, and they're responding to our issues and doing the best that we can to provide material for each other, then people come. They're not just ideas that are nice to talk about. Yeah, I don't know if I think we had two other groups. Maybe we want to do the two other groups' questions, and then we can do our wrap up.
So the first question is kind of more specific to the conditions in Cuba right now. So the topic of things being virtual and online and how that's been a struggle in organizing here. Our group was wondering how face-to-face organizing has been happening in Cuba, and how, yeah, if there's virtual stuff happening, just curiosities about how organizing is happening under COVID in Cuba. And the second question I think we've discussed is just, again, a how question of how do we involve the most marginalized in making a revolution, and related to that, what is the role of middle-class individuals in helping push that forward? And the last question, when thinking about also organizing at the local level, building power even in a neighborhood here in Holyoke, for example, what can we learn from Cuba about building national unity and building real coalitions between different sectors and classes in a diverse society to achieve concrete and tangible change in the short, medium, and long term. Is there anything else from our group? I feel like that was it. Yeah.
Maybe those were really good. I'm going to repeat back my notes because it was a lot. It was amazing questions. No, thank you. I don't apologize. Like how are Cubans organizing, like during the pandemic and face-to-face organizing? How are they approaching like the virtual question? How do we involve the most marginalized? What's the role of the middle class in pushing forward our revolutionary struggles? And what does it look like what do we have to learn about building national unity and like building power at a local level? So many good questions.
We also said looking at not just Cuba's history, but our history here. Like looking at the Black Panthers and the Young Patriots, right? How in our own history here in this country have we built unity, across, how does the Puerto Rico diaspora here create unity with Puerto Rico, right? And so that, for us to look at our own history as well.
Yeah, so to speak to the question a little bit about, how folks are dealing with organizing in COVID and things like that, I think something really unique that we spoke about in that group over there was the neighborhood structure and how easy it is, how it really does lend itself to community organizing in a really unique way that we kind of have to be a little bit more innovative here, like in Western Massachusetts. I think we did go to a panel of anti-racist organizers, and they, correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone lived in a similar community, and I think that was how they're able to like hold educational events like locally, like right down the street, and invite all their neighbors. They know their neighbors way more than I know my neighbors. So I think it's a question of like, building community. And then finding that political line together, like in our super hyper local communities. That would be something I think would be really cool to see here in Western Mass, and particularly like I think being thoughtful too. I think Caridad, you said this in our group. Like I don't know how many of us are from Holyoke here today. Maybe not everyone, but like we have this space in Holyoke. We have these spaces. We have a lot of co-sponsors for this event, and it's like, how do we continue to bring people into our conversation? How do we show up for other people? How do we support other campaigns in our neighborhood? And how can we like build a broad coalition? So I just answered the question with more questions, but I feel like those are the questions that are on my mind. Yeah. And then while we're reviewing the questions, I think one other thing I've been thinking a lot about is how important it is for middle class people, for like rich people as well, to be engaged in these movements and be willing to like be class traders. And I think it's really easy for middle class people, for wealthy people, to be engaged when it's convenient for them, and then to turn their back on the movement. And I think if you hold that privilege, you need to ask yourself, what's it going to take for me to continue to show up? I'm committed to showing up, like for my life. Like this is something I'm devoting my life to.
Be a class trader.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to answer the first one about how organizing is happening in Cuba right now with the pandemic and things being virtual. And I'm not an expert on this, so I'm going to just report what I saw. But we were like visiting like as the country was moving out of a certain stage of the pandemic.
Right.
So travel restrictions were about to be opening up. And they had spent a lot of resources making sure that they had continual vaccine access to their population. I think at that time it was about like 90% of the population was vaccinated against COVID. And so a lot of this organizing was kind of centered around access to that, and about like making sure that people and that they're logical and humane health policies in place in order to combat the pandemic. So contrasting that with how organizing happens here, we live in where we just throw our hands up in the air against COVID. So a lot of these conversations that they were having in Cuba were happening in person, and there's not like a lot of telecommunications infrastructure in place for like Zoom meetings and stuff like that to happen. So they were like masked up. They were like having meetings in person, and they were like engaging in person and having these conversations and having these organizing. doing this organizing in person. But they could do that because they were living in a socialist system that was trying at its best, under the circumstances it was under, to fight the pandemic. So that is the sense that I got. I could be wrong, honestly. I would encourage everyone to look this up and verify them on their own. But yes, yeah. And also, yeah, in terms of building power on a local level, I like, my personal definition of organizing is not like necessarily like holding rallies or like knocking on doors. It's having conversations with people and bringing regular people into the struggle. So on a local level, like if you are doing organizing, the best way to do that and the best way to bring normal people into the struggle is talking to your coworkers, talking to your family, and talking to the people around you. And that is like the most concrete way in order to build relationships and build the fundamental base under which that we can actually overthrow this whole thing. That's how I see it. And it's a very simplistic answer, and it's not like, it's not going to be applicable in every situation, but like that's where we start, and that's where we start kind of turning that switch in our mind that we're acting on our own, or that we have to do this one thing, or that we're going to make or break any kind of campaign or whatever because of our personal actions. And it's like, no, we all do little things, and we all are bringing each other into the same struggle, and we are acting, and we fail and we succeed collectively. So yeah.
Just add very briefly, because I don't think any one of us can really cover these things because they're such big questions. But I think that's a really great stabs at it. Yeah, I'd be a class traitor. I'll say that again. And echoing what you two said, but I think also like one of the asks today, like we have these little buckets, and we'll talk about that. There's like old soup Tupperware, and like around. We're also like asking folks to fundraise for the hurricane. Like Hurricane Ian just happened, and like tens of thousands of people in Cuba had to be evacuated, and so Code Pink and the People's Forum are like sending shipping containers of supplies. You can't just like send money to Cuba because of the blockade. So if you come from like a resource privileged background, like reach out to your networks, and it's an online thing, so you can, I think we have at the front like how to donate online, or you can give us cash and we'll send it for you, whatever works better. But like leverage your like position in the capitalist system to get resources where they're needed, and then dismantle that system. And I think about building unity, these are such big good questions, and I don't think they're simple answers, but yeah, like, I don't know, comrades aren't always friends, and I think that's okay. Like, like you can like not really like someone that much, but like see the importance of like building together with them and do that. So those are different things. Hopefully your friends are also comrades, but like you don't have to, like it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, if we like can build the kind of discipline that like, I don't know, we saw there and I've seen also here, it's not just like a foreign thing. I think it's okay, but like that's part of it. I don't know, there's so many things, and I do really hope that people continue talking about these. We'll have a thank you, Corey, and folks in the back for cooking. We'll and shortly, and hopefully continue talking about these things. The last thing I was just going to say on that, and I think this is actually, I forgot to mention to JR's question earlier. JR was sitting over here. That one of the things we saw, we went to Mejunje as a cultural center in Santa Clara, and like they shortly, like really at the beginning of the revolution, started organizing like a queer like cultural space, and that was an area of the revolution that like maybe wasn't all there at the beginning. And I think Fidel said, yeah, right, that's an understatement, sorry, but like one of the things Fidel said is like the biggest mistake that we made like was like thinking we knew like how to build the revolution. Like, it's a really hard process. And I think like one of the things that the director of that center who founded it also said is like, I didn't wait for permission, like I just did it, and like now I'm in conversations with the president, and like the things that we're doing have become national policy, but like I didn't wait for anybody to tell me that like as a queer person I should like be able to exist here. I just did it. So like just do it. I don't know, that's I think there's something to be said for that, and not waiting for somebody like to tell you that you can do something. Like if you don't see something happening, then make it happen. I think there's one more group. I know it's food smells good, which is enticing. So maybe if we could want to do the last group, and we'll just wrap up with some announcements after this.
Thanks so much, guys. We had a lot of great questions. It's okay if you don't have time to answer everything in depth, but I didn't want to leave anybody's questions out. Just briefly, we wanted to know, did you meet with any labor leaders in Cuba, and if you could just speak a little bit to the state of organized labor there and what that means. Also, one of the major items of propaganda we hear is that Cuba is a racist society. If you could speak a little bit to how you saw Cuba dealing with racism and what that looked like while you were there, that would be really great. And also, we just wanted to know if in the regular people that you talked to, there was an overarching thread of like just a sort of discourse people talk in, like in our own lives. Everything here is filtered through the media and the news with like maybe identity politics or we tend to narrowly define the things we're talking about. I don't know if in the people you talk to there was like one topic or way of looking at things that people specifically kept coming back to. Those were our questions. Thanks again.
Could you maybe just restate the third one?
Yeah, actually, is Kelly here?
Sure. Just whether there's a dominant ideological discourse, like in the way that I feel like here the dominant ideological discourse on the left is identity politics. So I'm wondering if there's a dominant ideological discourse.
Well, let me talk about the first one, actually. We did meet with prominent labor leaders in Cuba. We actually met with the General Secretary of the Central Workers Union as part of our first day, and as we talked to the auto workers and also some of the, what was the other group that we split off into? And there was the electric workers and the auto workers, yes. So we met with regular people, like rank and file members of the union, and we also met with the General Secretary of the Central Union in Cuba. Every worker in Cuba that is working in a state enterprise, which is most of them currently, that will change under the new reforms, but they will still have a lot of labor protections. And I shouldn't speak out of my ass, actually, so I'm going to hold on whether or not they're, but everyone who is under a public, in a public company is represented in that labor union. That labor union is extremely active and dictates labor policy inside of Cuba. And every rank and file member is involved in the process of forming directives and setting, setting outputs and setting hours and some benefits and stuff like that. So that is the state of Cuban labor, because that is what they fought for. That is labor is, and organized labor is one of the central apparatuses of the Cuban state and the Cuban Revolution. And so that is one of the major sites of not only both Cuban political society and activism, but also how most people relate to and engage with their work in everyday life. So, do any of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just a quick note on like the narrative around labor. I think it was really interesting to think that we heard from workers who were just expressing this deep pride in what they do, so much pride in their work and how they love to work to support their people and their country. And for us in the United States, like, we're working for our boss, and I just don't think we feel that same sense of pride. And so that's just one note.
Yeah, maybe on the second question, like the narrative of like Cuba as a racist society and how they're dealing with it. We got to meet with a group of Afro-Cuban activists who like tackle racism, and so they said this, and this was echoed in like a number of different, wasn't just them, but like a number of the different groups and activists that we met with, that like racism is effectively, like, there is no institutionalized racism in Cuba. Like, it is like racism is illegal in Cuba. That doesn't mean there isn't racism in Cuba. That's not true. But like in the U.S., we have like codified in our law like all these ways that like racism plays out. We have like all these lobby groups and all these politicians being like, how do I gerrymander? How do I make it harder for them to vote? How do I lock up more black people? How do I, like, that doesn't exist. What does exist is that, like we talked about before, that like Cuba is a society made up of human beings, and those human beings exist in a world system that is a very racist world system, and also like came from like a very racist like structure before the revolution, and so that still exists. So you had like, I think there's like, people talked a lot about like the process of like rooting that out. they're like Fidel put a really and the revolution has put a really big emphasis on like cultural work. So the cultural center we went to is really important because it's not just talking about ideas, but it's like there is this like just like music and dance and all these things, and like really instilling these ideas through all these different ways. And so it's not enough for racism to effectively be illegal in Cuba, but you have to like instill that and like inject that into society and every human being in that society. So there is racism in Cuba, but like Cuba actually like doesn't have the codified racist laws that our country does. And it's like coming out of a system, like all of these things, like the blockade has made it harder to get out of that, because like Cuba, like one of the things I was reading in Helen Yaffe's book, which is on the recommended reading list on the table, is like even during the special period in Cuba when the GDP in 3 years fell by 35%, like Cuba was like re-injecting money, all the money they had, like into society, into like health, because the most marginal, like the people who struggle the most with health, it comes from that same society. Like they're living in those houses that like were huts before when other people were living in mansions. And so by like, you know, having these social programs, it's also rooting out the conditions that have created so much segregation. It's not that racism doesn't exist in Cuba. That's not true. I didn't hear anyone say that. And I actually, a lot of like the spaces where you're led with that, it's like, we know that's the dominant, like, let's talk about it. What questions do you guys have? So I don't know. I thought to me that was really kind of amazing to see, and I think I forgot the other thought in my head. Did you?
In terms of the dominant narratives and how people identify politically in Cuba, the dominant ideological framework was interesting, and I made a note of it when I was there. Is that some of them will say, oh, you know, like I'm a socialist, maybe not a communist, I don't know, like, or I'm not a Stalinist or whatever, or you know, they'll disavow like the Communist Party or as an organ in their government, but they'll still like say like, but I'm still a revolutionary, and they'll like that is the main political identifier in Cuba, identity with the movement that brought down a lot of the old systems that kept most sectors of Cuban society like oppressed, and being further than that, being engaged in that process of revolution as a continual like process. That is something that we kept hearing, was just that like, I'm a revolutionary and this is a continuing revolution. This is like the legacy of it. And we live that every day, and there was pride in that, and we saw that on May Day, and we saw that in people that we talked to, regular people, and there's a lot of people who are like also against that, and they will tell you freely. They're like, oh, we're not revolutionary, like we hate the government, we like, and people will feel comfortable and very open to tell you that. But for the most part, we saw like that was what I saw as the primary like ideological drive. I'm still trying to wrap my head around like what that means, I guess. In practice, but like, yeah, that is what I noticed the most. Yeah. If anyone else wants to add to that.
Sorry, I knew there was something that fell out of my head and I recovered it. On the question of racism, is that like one of the areas that kept being pointed to as like this is an area where racism really like flourishes in Cuba is like through private businesses, and so because of like Cuba, because of the pressure created by the blockade, like there have been a series of reforms at different moments. Like how does Cuba like there are all these like big questions, like how do we get enough money? How does Cuba get enough money to like not just socialize poverty, but to be able to fund like, you know, these like the development of vaccines and these medical programs. And so they've had to make these different concessions to get hard currency. And one of those is allowing more private business, and allowing, so like Cubans who historically have been tied to wealth from before the revolution, like the first big wave of immigration was like right after the revolution was like capital flight, like all the rich white Cubans left, and like many of them went to Florida. And so that's, the demographics of migration have like changed somewhat over time. So that's definitely not the only like group demographic of Cubans in Florida, but like the people in the best position to send remittances are like the richest Cubans who, you know, many of whom are in Miami. And so they're sending money back to their families who are like tied to the old oligarchy, who then can have these private businesses and employ private businesses, and the government's kind of been cornered because like they need currency, because they need to, in order to like have 96% of the population who has their own homes, in order to develop 5 COVID vaccines, like you have to have money to do that. And so like they're like, even though there are various restrictions and that still goes through the state, it's not just like a free-for-all. Like it opens areas for contradictions, not by accident, but kind of because. So it's like the worst part, the like area where racism is the worst in Cuba is the U.S.'s fault, effectively. Although there's still like, you know, everything is a process, and I thought that was interesting. But okay, so these are such amazing questions. Those are not even answers; they're just like you know, thoughts. But thank you for asking them. Corey and Mikey and folks in the back have been making food, and so I won't spend too much time on this very last piece of just some like next steps and calls to action. But a next event, I think, like, yeah, we heard over and over and over again, you know, like the best thing you can do for the Cuban Revolution is to go home and make your own revolution. This event, yeah, cheers to that. Big task. There are like, I don't know, a dozen organizations that have co-sponsored this event. So if you're interested in joining IAC, come talk to us. Obviously, the 3 of us are in IAC, Mikey and Corey in the back, JR, Hector, there are a number of us here. Come talk to us. If you're interested in, if you're already in another organization, like we'd be very excited to continue to collaborate more. If you are like feel called to another organization that co-sponsored it, like I don't think I can do a run through of all of them because then I'm just going to make you all sit here forever. But like I see Liang, I see Code Pink, I see like PSL, there are all these different groups here, like talk to them and then we can work together through that group. Just like do something through an organization and make the revolution happen here. So that's the biggest call to action. In addition, yeah, things are really hard in Cuba right now. The hurricane was really devastating. So there's some, Simone over there has some information. Simone, say hi, maybe, on like if you want to donate online, you can do that. If you have cash or whatever thing, we also have a Venmo. So like Venmo, cash, open your phone, donate directly through the Code Pink and People's Forum thing. We'll send all of that money there. And then I don't think we were able to set up a computer. We were going to hope that folks did this here on the spot, but there is a letter to Biden currently going around that like to lift the blockade, especially like in the wake of the sanctions, or always the wake of the sanctions, in the wake of the hurricane, to like ease things at least a little bit. So I guess we can send that out in an email, but could sign that. You know, the demands include removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. There's a number of those. So I think someone asked earlier about how to go to Cuba, like go on a brigade. Like that was a thing we heard a lot too. Like, you know, it's like there's this like information blockade too, and one of the ways of breaking that is by going to Cuba. So it was really amazing. Like there are many brigades, Code Pink, Venceremos, Pastors for Peace. I can write that on one of the stickies. Go to Cuba and talk to other people about it and figure out how that connects to your work and study. And then we left some reading materials on the table. One of there are 2 books in particular I would really suggest folks read that are really tied to this. One is We Are Cuba is really great. That's my copy. But you know, read that. There's I don't know if you want to like wave the copy of. Okay, actually. Okay, I happen to have a copy because I went to an event yesterday that was so good that everybody should go buy their book. So there's like a platform that was just published. The launch event was yesterday in New York called Socialist Reconstruction that like lays out a vision for like very concretely like what a revolutionary platform could look like here. I'm not in the PSL, although I'm a fan. Ramona is in the PSL and Ramona has those books. I forgot the postcards at home, but there are a couple. So if you want one, talk to Ramona. To wrap up, there's, before we pass it over to our comrades at the Liang Network who have an upcoming event, we are having a film screening on Wednesday. There's a little yellow flyer right there at 7:30 at Bishop's Lounge, thanks to Mikey. It's a film screening in conversation with a Venezuelan minister, Carlos Ron, and who Hector and I actually met with in Venezuela. We talked about that at our last event. And Alex Saab is a kidnapped diplomat, so the U.S. Effectively kidnapped him, and he's in jail in pretty bad conditions. And so there's a demand to release him. And this event is going to be film screening a documentary, and also like entering into conversation with his wife, with Saab's wife, and Camila Fabri, and Carlos Ron. So I'd suggest folks go through that, go to those, and then if I know we have a really exciting event coming up with the Liang Network, so it was one of our co-sponsors. I would suggest, I'm going to turn over the mic and then.
Hi, my name is Anastasia. I'm the regional coordinator for Liang, Western Massachusetts, and we're a local to global advocacy network that amplifies the calls to action of indigenous, peasant farming, and environmental defense communities in the Philippines. So next Sunday, October 23rd, from 4 to 6:30 p.m., we're going to be hosting a report back that's going to be co-sponsored by IAC, and it's at the Brick House Community Center in Turners Falls. This event is going to include perspectives from folks who recently traveled to the Philippines over the summer. So farmers make up the majority of the Philippines population, and despite this, majority of Filipinos experience food insecurity and poverty due to economic policies in the country, which are imposed by a puppet government retained by the U.S. So a lot of similar things to what we discussed here today. Filipino landless peasant farmers are especially vulnerable, and they suffer from land grabbing, resource theft, and state violence at the hands of landlords and state forces. This has gone on for centuries. The people of the Philippines have never ceased to struggle for their self-determination and sovereignty, and today they serve as an inspiration to liberation movements across the world. So we hope you join us next Sunday for a report back from the Philippines to learn more about what the struggle looks like today and why international solidarity is crucial. I have some flyers that I will pass out. Feel free to take one if you are interested. And I'm available for questions. There are a few of us floating around. Thanks.
And just shortly, since the food is getting like really cold, everybody's probably hungry, we'll be doing monthly Marxist movie nights over at Nueva Esperanza that IAC will be like co-sponsoring, and we're going to be asking for a couple of their co-sponsors. But we'll be watching this month Soy Cuba, kind of like in coalition of this event. Soy Cuba is a really great film that was filmed in the 60s that highlighted pre, during, and post-revolutionary period of Cuba. Please come. There'll be pizza, drinks, and all that stuff. But you'll get notified through the email.
Okay. Yeah, hang out, eat some food. These are such big questions. Keep talking about them. And thank you everyone so much for coming.